What we should guard against, and this is likely to occur, is that those of the developed countries which are at present are operated under carbon-propelled vehicles, we may see a surge, a sudden surge of disposal of these vehicles. And where are the sites going to be? The likelihood is that they will have their sites on Africa. Africa being the destination of the unwanted, or those of the products which have been phased out. And we need to guard against it. And I'm quite prepared to work with my colleague here to come up with policies, come up with strategies by which we will avert this sudden surge. Because no doubt this sudden surge is likely to retard our efforts at trying to industrialize. And this is a conversation that we are having in the region. Let me, there's plenty that we can discuss, but in the interest of time, let me make room for others to echo their views and reflections on so far what has occurred. So, thank you very much, Mr. Proof.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. I believe now it's Re Kibine to just echo his side of the story in terms of the industry. Briefly, because we don't have time, the ministers are supposed to go and brief somewhere. So we are just running behind time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Honorable ministers here present, I'm not going to say much because my honorable minister has covered the full ground. I can just buttress on the issue of VAT claims and request our South African counterparts to really work closely with us, with SARS. We continue to meet with BEARS here, which is the equivalent of SARS, on the issue of VAT claims and on the issue of, we also have found out that some of the delays, although they are port related, but they could also be inland related, because we have had in the past, and we've engaged SARS, that some of our containers that are in transit to beyond South Africa get opened in places like Mafikeng for inspection. So would urge the two authorities, being SARS and BEARS, to also work closely together to ensure that these unnecessary delays are removed, because they become very costly to the traders when we do delays that are not necessary. But I would like also to just briefly say, Honorable Ministers, infrastructure development is a critical element. And infrastructure here, I'm not talking hard infrastructure, which is roads, rail, necessarily. Border gate infrastructure, if we can improve that, we will benefit quite a lot. The industry will benefit a lot in that. We have found that analysis show that tariff reductions, as we now get into the continental free trade area, tariff reductions are another area that we have to look at, and we should, as the Honorable Minister just said, we should stop being protectionist and work together, collaborate, and say, how do we expand? Because the better the tariff reductions, the benefit to the industry. Alternatively, we also have non-tariff barriers that we really have to look at and ensure that we remove them as much as they can. And I know most of these non-tariff barriers are not part of a law that was created or a policy or an act. It could be just people just wanting to either make a little buck and stopping people on the roads and coming up with ridiculous charges. I remember some years back, a truck was stopped on a Saturday because it was said to be, the height was too high. Instead of 4.1 meters, I think it was 4.2 meters, and the charge was 2,000 pula, and the driver did not have the money, and this truck was carrying perishable goods, so it was stuck, and the goods went bad. So it becomes, for Mr. Mulele and myself in the private sector, we don't sleep when things like those happen because you will get a call 24 hours. So I do believe that with what both ministers have said this morning, with what the Minister of Mepando also said, I'm sure the ground has been set for us to ensure that as private sector we engage and we know where to engage. I think that's what the critical thing is, Honorable Minister. We should know a contact point that if anything happens, we need to go to and be able to get answers and solutions from that person, because the longer it takes, the more expensive it becomes. I think I'll stop here because Honorable Minister, as I said, has said enough already, so I don't want to repeat what he has said. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll hand over to the Honorable Minister, Re Patel, on the South African side. Thank you, Honorable Minister. You may take your seats.
Let me start first by thanking you, our program director, and then good afternoon to members of the media. Of course, I've spent a bit of time now this morning with my colleague, Minister Gavela. And really, I just wanted to make a few remarks. The first was to welcome program director that you have renamed me. I call it the Botswanization of my name, Ephraim, so I feel more at home here. And to my colleague, Minister Gavela, I want to endorse the view that we need to work with each other because we share a border, but we also share a people. We share people with very significant cross-border, these borders that are a function of lines drawn on a map at some stage in our history don't represent the true reality of Southern Africa's people. And so I hear more and see more of the language of Botswana in South Africa than anyone can imagine. It's really one country, one culture. I spoke earlier in addressing the business community about the reality that both Botswana and South Africa has very significant needs, and I pointed those needs out in areas of growth, of jobs, of economic inclusion, and of industrialization. But I also pointed to the fact that there are opportunities, that the world we're in today is a more complex world than it was yesterday, that COVID-19 reminded us of the vulnerabilities of those economies and those societies that don't have an industrial base, that the Ukraine conflict has underlined that message with the supply chain disruptions that have meant, in many cases, our factories standing still, unable to produce because critical components cannot be sourced from Asia or from the Americas or from Europe. And it's given us the important lesson that as Southern Africa and as the African continent, we need to industrialize and deepen that industrialization. And so we see an opportunity to turn Southern Africa into a production and innovation hub. And that means thinking through a reframing of our economic relationships. We were frank with each other about the challenges because friends are open about their problems and they then are able to find ways of dealing with those problems. South Africa's unemployment rate is extraordinary, 35%, one of the highest in the world. We have 11.5 million unemployed people, mainly young people. We have to resolve that challenge which is at the center of the thinking of the South African government. And we need to create millions of new jobs in manufacturing, in mining, in agriculture, in the services sector. And that's really what we focused on. And so when we look at neighbors, we see opportunity to work together with neighboring countries in unlocking opportunities elsewhere in the world. And I'm going to come back to that. So given that we recognize the importance of industrialization for Botswana and Botswana recognizes the importance of industrialization for South Africa. How do we move away from a zero-sum game in which the benefit of the one is at the expense of the other? How can we find complementarities where we move forward together? And so when we look just at the South African economy, and I'm sure the same could be done in Botswana, we see a very high level of imports by South Africa from Asia, from Europe, from the Americas. When I go into a shop in Botswana, I see a similar pattern. When I go into a Nigerian shop or Ghanaian shop or Kenya, wherever I travel across the continent, I make a point of going to the shops and just checking where the product's coming from. That represents 8 trillion rands worth of imports from other countries, of which only 1 trillion is satisfied by other African countries. That's what I see in the African market. So instead of us seeking to solve South Africa's 11.5 million unemployment problem by squeezing the remaining factories in Botswana and trying to get the production taken away from Botswana to South Africa, or instead of Botswana seeking to address its challenge of 250,000 young people that are looking for work here in Botswana by trying to see how it can displace a South African factory or two, it's to say there is a net 7 billion rands worth of goods that the continent imports from other parts of the world. How do we now coordinate, create the cross-border value chains, the investment, the product analysis? And we highlighted, earlier in my remarks, I highlighted the few key areas that we needed to work on, and I'll come back to that. And so Minister Gafela and I have begun to work with each other, first on the African Continental Free Trade Area, and secondly in thinking through the relationship between Botswana and South Africa and how we can do more in ways that grow both economies. South Africa is a bigger economy, without any question, but it's also a bigger population. We've just gone officially over 60 million people. And so we both need to grow. And for that reason, in the African Continental Free Trade Area, we've made the argument, Botswana's made the argument, South Africa's made the argument in the Council of Ministers that the AFC FTA it has to have rules of origin that allows African products to get preferences with each other. And so whether it is on the many different products that we have, we say, look for the Made in Africa label. Instead of taking products, instead of saying this microphone will be largely imported from Asia and South Africa just does the relabeling, it creates virtually no jobs. Why not make the foam? Why not make the microphone itself? Why not invest in the electronics that sits behind sophisticated PA systems? And so that's really the direction that we're going, and we think it creates enormous opportunity. We've looked at what we call the Big Five, and in this case the Big Five is really about the opportunities that lie there. We say work together on export destinations, work together on identifying the products, work together in connecting the region's value chains, work together on logistics, and we've heard earlier from the business representative the frustrations and difficulties that businesses experience with the logistics, and it was given a great specificity. And finally, let's work together on an investment plan. So this is the Big Five. The opportunities that we have is not only in industrial production, but that's our main focus now, to see what we can do there. It's also in other areas, getting an integrated tourism development strategy for the region. Think about it. You can hardly think of a place in the world that has the attractions that a few countries here in Southern Africa has. In one visit by a Chinese or an Indian or European tourist or an American tourist, they can see what they cannot see anywhere else in the world. And so we've got to package that better and leverage off our strengths there. So we're starting a new journey in which we are saying, what is complementary? What can we do differently? We're also celebrating some successes. South Africa has been able to get some traction in its localization program. We're beginning to look at different, I saw, for example, some edible oils here earlier that's produced in Botswana. We don't have edible oil refinery capacity for crude oil, so we're building one in Richards Bay. But we're also looking to celebrate successes that Botswana has had. And I gave the example earlier of two sectors, the wire harness one and the plastic pipes, where Botswana is showing industrial strength and the ability to produce on scale and to the standards required in the market. So this is where we will be going. It's really an opportunity, a completely new journey to see how we unlock what is available. I focus most of my remarks on the AFC FTA because it's Africans learning that we must begin to change our production and consumption patterns. I said to the business community, Africa does not produce what it consumes, and Africa does not consume what it produces. We produce copper, and then we send it to the rest of the world. And changing that, using our enormous resource, natural resource base, is going to make a change. Africa accounts for 17% of the world's population, less than 1% of car production in the world. 17% of the world's population, less than 1% of steel production. 17% of the world's population, 3% of the world's GDP. So it's in our hands to change that, and we're not going to change it by eating each other's little breakfasts. It's by training our industrial and innovative capabilities on these massive markets and unlocking those markets for goods made in Southern Africa and indeed goods made on the African continent. So I want to end off by saying that Minister Gafela has brought a very practical approach to things, and I hope that we'd be able to walk this road. I've taken note carefully of the challenges and frustrations, and we're going to facilitate meetings between SARS and the team in Botswana. I've also walked around in the marketplace, the exhibition that has been set aside, and I'd encourage members of the media to go there. You see there examples of the industrial strength of Botswana. You'll also see examples of industrial outputs from South Africa, so both are there. And we spoke to a number of players. I mean, we went to the one player, the very first one, and it was a biltong producer. And his storyline was so wonderful. He says, this packet of biltong here is a partnership. The meat comes from Botswana. The skills to turn it into the tastiest biltong that we've ever had is skills here in Botswana. The packaging comes from South Africa. The spices come from South Africa. Bringing all of this together then produces a product that can go on markets not just in Botswana, but across the region. And indeed, we don't want biltong only to be sold here. West Africa is waiting, East Africa is waiting. So that gives me an example, and there were a few such examples. So I look forward to the strengthening and building on the relationship under the leadership of our two heads of state, and with both Minister Gafela and I knowing that we have to roll up our sleeves to get things moving because we have young people who need jobs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Ministers. Ke a leboga Minister Patel, le Minister Gafela. Bagaetsho, the time is not on our side. Ka jalo, I'm going to be a bit on you when you ask questions. Be brief and to the point. And I'm going to just take only two. Our ministers are supposed to have left around 2:30. But you can check your hands, you can see receive. So at this juncture, I'll just, with that question. Oh, the mic is just next to you, sir. The rules are this way. You say who you are.
There's need for proper road to link the bridge and rail as well. In the space of coal and soda ash, there's need for rail, for the parallel rail. What are high-level discussions between the two countries in sort of to explore alternative financing models to bring in the private sector, triple Ps such as that? Thank you.
Over to you, ministers.
Should I go first?
Yes.
Rasi Suras asked a question. I'm afraid to say to you, sir, that yes, there are allegations of tension between the two countries, but we must function not on, at least speaking for myself, as a retardation of which can compromise our health, including also compromising our education. So it's important that at all times we look out for the best trade practices ever, so that we foster them in order to sustain the current peace and tranquility. You all know, no doubt about it, that when there is disturbance in the tranquility and the peace with which we trade, there's turmoil. People go up in arms. We see the likes of xenophobic behavior. So there's that balance that we need to at all times be watchful of, to ensure that we don't tilt the scales in favor of exposing ourselves to unrest. But the long and short of it is, with respect, sir, let me say to you that there is no tension. Not that I know of that has been vouched for. But I do not deny the allegations that there is tension between the two countries. With the second question, Colleen. My goodness. Well, do you want to take it, Mr.? What was the question? My goodness. My apologies, Chairman. Just the detail of it.
It was how to avoid under-industrializing a third
yes,
country.
Yes, thank you. Yes, we are having conversations about that, ma'am. My apologies, I didn't actually write the questions. We are quite aware that when you put a strong economy side by side, one which is not as strong as it is, you run that risk. And we've come to terms with South African authorities and ourselves that is a challenge which we have faced in Botswana for some time. And we now seek to reverse the situation. That is why we have now embarked on a policy in terms of which, as I've said earlier, each sovereign looks at what it is strong at. It then embarks on growing it. And the other doesn't embark on direct competition with it. Because we know that it is quite difficult to compete against a stronger economy. So Mr. Patel and I, when we took each other aside and spoke, we came to a gentleman's agreement that we are going to assist each other to industrialize, meaning that we are not going to compete against each other in respect of those areas which we find ourselves strong at, including also making it easier for our locally manufactured goods from here finding access into the South African market. So these are conversations that we're having, removing barriers to entry of our products to them, and so on and so forth, ma'am. There was that last question, the third one on financing. We are exploring ways in which triple Ps can function. One of the things that we are seriously mooting, and this is not a matter which I've had discussions with my colleague on, is the possibility of retinkering or revamping the triple P model that we thought we would function with. What seems to be workable is the relinquishment of the responsibility to carry out infrastructure to the likes of agencies without much government involvement therein, with a model in terms of which they would also recoup their costs. But we have come to agree or come to the realization that retaining the responsibility to plan a piece of work, put it together and actually execute it within government. Often, firstly, we suffer tremendous delays, escalation of costs, and often corruption also creeps in. So we think that if these things are placed in the hands of agents, the business mentality will kick in. The work will be done on time within budgets, and there will be no room for corruption. But we do have the likes of Afreximbank, who in the light of the challenges that we've had have come forth, pledged support but not only in infrastructure development, but in the setting up of industrial, or the development of the growth of these industrialization pursuits. We're having discussions with them. I did dispatch our chief negotiator to go and have a word with them to see what kind of model it is that they are pledging, and we think we can be accommodated under it. So we do have these international players, ma'am, who are our partners, who see the importance of supporting us in industrializing Africa, and not only Botswana. I hope I've done justice to your questions. Let me ask my colleague to perhaps also add on, if there's time.
So first, thank you very much. I think Minister Gafela covered the three questions very, very comprehensively. So I'll confine my remarks just to the following. On the first question, South Africa and Botswana are not only neighbors, they also have a shared history, a shared culture. Trade is required and industrial development is required to lift the standards of living and create jobs on both sides of the border. And that is something that we've seen both heads of state are deeply committed to. So I've seen there a strong call by the President of Botswana and the President of South Africa for us to see how we can, in fact, strengthen both economies. On the question of how to avoid de-industrializing or under-industrializing others as we embark on our own journey of industrialization, we're looking at a very detailed analysis of products that are coming onto the African continent's markets from destinations or sourcing countries in Asia, in the Americas, in Europe. And within that, we're looking to see where is there an opportunity for us to produce. So if you take the auto value chain, we continue, even though we have a very large sector in South Africa, a significant part of the components are still imported. And they're imported from countries outside the African continent. That represents an opportunity to replace that. And so it's product by product that we look at that. We will not solve our own problems or Africa's problems if we were to seek to displace Nigerian business or the industrialists in Kenya or the factories in Egypt. The much bigger prize is to displace imports coming from outside the African continent. And given the fact and the statistics that I've quoted about Africa's place in the world, it is a position that we can put forward to the rest of the world. I've put this position to colleagues, trade ministers from developed and developing countries, that this is Africa's opportunity to industrialize. That the AFC FTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, is that moment. And we just need to show determination in doing that. On the third question, again, Minister Gafela has dealt with it in considerable detail. I would emphasize that there's a role for both the public sector and the private sector, that what we look for from the private sector is a combination of capital, skills, and governance practices. What we look at from the public sector is the history, the capabilities, the focus on development outcomes, but we also need to ensure that in the public sector we strengthen skills development and we ensure proper governance. South Africa has gone through a period where there were governance challenges and lapses in our major state-owned companies. We've taken ownership of it by recognizing it, by not denying it, and saying we will fix it, and we're in the process. You've seen some of the examples of changes to boards, changes to personnel. That's just the first step. Beyond that, it is ensuring a professionalization of the public sector across the continent, that we are able to take the best and most talented Africans and let them feel that there's a space for them in the public sector. And then to work in great partnership with the private sector. The private sector can bring much to our efforts to industrialize and to build those kind of infrastructure platforms that help us to industrialize. So we don't see a trade-off between these where we have to choose one or the other. It's complementing the skills base between public and private. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Ministers. You may take your seats.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. Ibrahim Patel, Honorable Minister, Minister Khafel. Ke a leboga betso re ka go jala ntšha ke ra laja